Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Thanks for having me. It is a real privilege to be exploring this with you today.
Okay, so I want you to imagine stumbling through this thick, just choking fog of war. You're covered in mud.
Yeah.
You're covered in blood.
Yeah, the worst conditions imaginable.
Right. And you have just survived this brutal hand-to-hand combat in a field that has basically been turned into a slaughterhouse.
Just absolute chaos all around you.
Exactly. So you drop to your knees, you are completely exhausted, and you roll over the body of the man you just killed.
Okay.
You reach down, you pull off his heavy iron helmet, hoping to loot whatever gold he might have on him. And as the visor comes away,
Oh, man.
you find yourself staring into the dead, unblinking eyes of your own father.
It is just, it's an unimaginably horrific scenario. And yet, well, it is the exact reality we're confronted with when we open the text for this deep dive today.
Yeah, welcome to the 15th century, folks. Welcome to the Wars of the Roses.
It's definitely not a fairy tale.
No, not at all. If you think the history of human conflict is this, neat little timeline of good guys in white hats and bad guys in black hats, well, William Shakespeare's Henry VI, Part 3 is going to completely shatter that illusion for you.
Oh, absolutely. It shatters it into a million pieces.
Right. Today, we are taking a massive deep dive into a text that portrays a moral and political landscape so murky, so blood-soaked, and so incredibly complex that it just forces you to question everything you know about leadership, ambition, and, honestly, survival.
And the good news is we are not wandering into this historical wreckage alone.
Thank goodness.
Right. We are bringing along the insights of the legendary 19th century literary critic William Hazlitt.
Hazlitt is just brilliant on this stuff.
He really is. He had this extraordinary ability to look at Shakespeare's plays not just as, entertainment, but as these profound psychological case studies.
So our mission in this deep dive is to act as your thoughtful guides through the wreckage. We want to extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the true life application from this ancient bloody text.
Because the power struggles of the 1400s, all those betrayals, the passivity, the ruthless ambition.
It's all still relevant.
Yeah, it has a terrifying amount to teach you about how you live, how you lead, and how you survive your own conflicts today.
For sure. But to understand the wisdom, I guess we first have to understand the environment that Shakespeare builds for us here.
Right, the historical and human context.
Yeah.
And Hazlitt, in his commentary, gives us this unflinching description of the civil wars between the House of York and the House of Lancaster.
The White Rose and the Red Rose.
Exactly. He describes the England of this era as a perfect bear garden.
A bear garden. That phrase sounds almost quaint to a modern ear. Like a messy kindergarten classroom or something.
It really does sound mild today.
Yeah.
But a bear garden in Shakespeare's time was incredibly visceral. It wasn't a place you went to look at botany.
No, not at all.
It was a literal arena for blood sports.
Yeah.
Bear baiting.
Oh, wow. Right.
Yeah, they would chain a real bear to a post, unleash a pack of starving dogs on it, and the public would just stand around and place bets while the animals tore each other to pieces.
That is horrifying.
It was loud, it was brutal, and it was entirely unnatural. Hazlitt uses that specific word to tell you that the setting of this play is not some noble battlefield of chivalrous knights fighting for honor.
Right. It's not King Arthur.
No, it is a locked cage of pure, unadulterated slaughter.
So that scene I described at the very beginning, the son discovering he has killed his father, that happens right in the middle of this bear garden.
Yes, specifically at the Battle of Towton. And Shakespeare, he actually compounds the horror in that scene.
Wait, it gets worse.
Oh, yeah. Immediately after that young soldier realizes he has murdered his own father, another soldier enters the stage dragging a young man he just killed.
Don't tell me.
Yep. Only to discover it is his only son.
Oh my gosh. And King Henry VI is just standing there watching this unfold. He is the king, the man ostensibly responsible for the realm, and he is reduced to a spectator of this intimate annihilation.
Just completely helpless.
Yeah. He looks at the dead son's face and delivers this haunting lament about the fatal colors of our striving houses. He points out that the red blood of Lancaster and the white skin of York are literally mixed on this boy's dead face.
It's such a powerful image.
He says, wither one rose and let the other flourish. If you contend, 1,000 lives must wither.
And the mechanism of this conflict is really what makes it so tragic. Like, the son was pressed into service by King Henry's forces.
Right.
And the father was pressed into service by the Earl of Warwick on the side of York. They didn't even know they were fighting on opposite sides.
That's insane.
Shakespeare is showing you the unnatural tearing apart of the social fabric. A bear garden environment doesn't just destroy armies, it destroys the most fundamental human bonds.
It turns a society into just a transactional meat grinder.
Exactly. And we see that transactional nature constantly. Look at the Earl of Warwick, the man history literally calls the Kingmaker.
The Kingmaker, yeah, he's a huge deal.
Huge deal. He fates a massive bloody war to pull Henry off the throne and put the Duke of York's son, Edward, on it.
Right. He succeeds in doing that.
He does. But the moment King Edward impulsively marries a local widow, Lady Grey, instead of the French princess Warwick was negotiating with,
Warwick just flips.
He just flips. He immediately joins the very people he just slaughtered simply because his ego was bruised.
The fluidity of loyalty in this text is just staggering. I mean, when the system demands that you wear a specific color, a red rose or a white rose, and view everyone wearing the other color as an existential threat, the environment devolves completely.
The institution itself becomes the predator.
Yeah. And, it is really easy for you listening to sit back and think, well, I'm glad we evolved past the 1400s.
Sure, we don't use swords anymore.
Right. But I challenge that distance. Look at your own life. Think about modern hyperpolarized environments today.
Oh, they are everywhere.
They really are. Think about a fractured political landscape where striving houses demand absolute ideological purity. And if you step out of line, you are dead to them.
Yeah, families literally tear each other apart at the Thanksgiving dinner table over loyalty to a political color.
Exactly. Or think about a toxic corporate culture. You have departments that are basically at war, sabotaging each other for a larger piece of the budget, entirely forgetting they work for the same company.
That happens all the time. The dynamics of the bear garden are unfortunately timeless. When survival requires you to view your neighbor as an enemy combatant, humanity is always the first casualty.
Always. Which brings us to the central question of this exploration. When the system you are forced to operate in turns into a bear garden, how do you survive without becoming a beast yourself?
And Shakespeare explores that exact question by setting up this really fascinating central tension. We are going to look closely at King Henry VI's passive morality up against the ruthless ambition of the people circling him.
Right, the sharks in the water.
Exactly. Namely, the Duke of York, Henry's own Queen Margaret, and Richard of Gloucester.
So the inciting incident of this entire play happens right in Act 1, and it is just a masterclass in psychological agony.
Set the scene for us.
Okay, so the Duke of York has literally broken into the palace. He is sitting on Henry's throne.
Just sitting there.
Just sitting there.
Yeah.
Henry walks in with his lords, and you would expect swords to be drawn immediately. Blood everywhere. But instead, they have this incredibly tense, desperate negotiation.
Because Henry is terrified of civil war.
Completely terrified. He wants to avoid bloodshed at all costs. And in the middle of this standoff, Henry turns away and mutters to himself and to the audience, "I know not what to say, my title's weak."
Yeah, we have to unpack the historical mechanism behind that decision because it is basically the key to Henry's entire character.
Why is his title weak?
Well, Henry's grandfather, Henry IV, usurped the throne from Richard II. He took it by force.
Okay, so it was stolen.
Yes. And the Duke of York actually descends from an older, more direct bloodline. So by the strict rules of the divine right of kings, York actually has a stronger legitimate claim to the crown than Henry does.
Wow. So Henry is suffering from a massive existential case of imposter syndrome. He knows, deep down, he is sitting on a stolen chair.
He really does. And that guilt just paralyzes him. So to avoid the immediate conflict, Henry makes an astonishing deal.
This blew my mind when I read it.
Right. He agrees to disinherit his own son, Prince Edward. Henry insists he will keep the crown for the rest of his natural life, but upon his death, the crown will bypass his own flesh and blood and go to the Duke of York and his heirs.
It's unthinkable for a king to do that.
It really is. But Henry genuinely believes he has secured peace with this compromise.
But he hasn't secured peace at all. He has just poured gasoline on a fire. Because his wife, Queen Margaret, finds out what he has done.
And her reaction is legendary.
It is blistering. She bursts into the room and she absolutely dissects his failure of leadership. She calls him a timorous wretch. Yeah. She points out the insane strategic flaw in his plan, asking him, basically, to entail him and his heirs onto the crown, What is it but to make thy sepulchre and creep into it far before thy time?
She grasps the political reality that Henry's idealism totally blinds him to.
Right.
Because by making York the heir, Henry has made his own continued existence the only obstacle to York's ultimate goal.
It's like painting a target on his own back.
Exactly. As Margaret says, such safety finds the trembling lamb environed with wolves. Henry's passivity isn't just weak, it is actively suicidal.
Yeah.
And Margaret is so disgusted by his willingness to prefer his own temporary comfort over his honor and his family's future that she publicly divorces herself from his table and his bed.
Just cuts him off completely.
She declares she will raise an army herself to defend her son's birthright.
Now, William Hazlitt's analysis of Henry is brilliant here because he forces you to look at the actual anatomy of failure. Hazlitt compares Henry VI to the king his grandfather deposed, Richard II.
Yes. Hazlitt observes that while both kings lost their crowns due to mismanagement and what he calls imbecility.
Great word.
Great word, right. Their psychological profiles are diametrically opposed. A lesser writer would have just made them interchangeable weak kings. But Shakespeare's imagination borrows from life.
So how are they different?
Well, Hazlitt points out that Richard II lost his crown from a thoughtless, willful abuse of power. Richard was steeped in pride. He believed the divine right of kings meant he was literally untouchable.
Like he could do whatever he wanted.
Exactly, that angels would descend from heaven to fight his battles while he just did whatever he pleased.
So Richard lost his crown out of arrogance, but Henry loses it out of apathy.
Precisely.
Hazlitt describes Henry's failure not as the pride of a voluptuary, but as an indolent, good-natured mind, naturally averse to the turmoils of ambition and the cares of greatness.
He doesn't want the job.
No. Henry actually wants to do the right thing, but he is fundamentally terrified of exercising power incorrectly. He is so paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong choice, so he makes no choice at all.
Henry basically views his position as a moral burden rather than a tool for action. He possesses the desire to be good, but he totally lacks the fortitude to actually defend the good against those who wish to dismantle it.
You know, I see this exact dynamic destroying organizations and families today.
Oh, absolutely.
Think about a leader who just hates conflict. A manager who refuses to fire a highly toxic employee because they, quote unquote, just want everyone to get along.
Right. They think they're being the nice guy.
Exactly. They think they are being kind. They think they are preserving the peace. But in reality, they are completely abandoning the high-performing, vulnerable team members who actually rely on them for protection.
Yeah, they're letting the wolves in the sheep pen.
Henry is like a ship captain who refuses to take the wheel because he's afraid of steering them into a reef. So he just lets the hurricane smash the ship against the rocks, comforting himself with the thought that at least his hands weren't on the wheel when it happened.
That is a really crucial distinction for us today. Passive goodness in a position of authority is indistinguishable from complicity. Henry's desire for peace throws his wife, his son, and his entire kingdom to the wolves.
But you know, I want to push back on this a little bit. Or rather, I want to explore the flip side of Henry's passivity.
Okay, let's do it.
Because Henry's aversion to conflict isn't just pure cowardice, right? It is rooted in a very specific, almost monastic philosophy.
Yes.
And this brings us to what is arguably the most famous moment of Henry's life and a really vital piece of wisdom with discernment for you listening. We need to talk about the crown of content.
Right, the crown of content. So this takes place back at the Battle of Towton. The slaughter is raging all around him, and King Henry has essentially been told by his wife and his generals to go sit on a hill and stay out of the way because they fight better without him.
Which is just embarrassing.
Very. So the anointed king of England finds a molehill.
Wait, a literal molehill?
A literal molehill, and he sits down on it while his subjects murder each other, and he delivers this profound, soaring soliloquy.
What does he say?
He watches the battle swaying back and forth like the sea, and he wishes with all his heart that he was a homely swain, a simple shepherd.
No.
He dreams of sitting on a hill, carving out sundials, watching the minutes and hours pass in quiet order, tending his flock, taking his rest. He says the hawthorn bush gives a sweeter shade to a shepherd than a rich embroidered canopy gives to kings who constantly fear their subjects' treachery.
The imagery there is so tactile. He contrasts the shepherd's homely curds and the cold, thin drink out of a leather bottle with the prince's delicates and the viands sparkling in a golden cup.
It's beautiful.
It is this beautiful pastoral fantasy of a life totally unburdened by ambition.
And this internal philosophy becomes externalized a bit later in Act 3. Henry has secretly returned to England from exile, wearing a disguise, basically simply carrying a prayer book.
Okay.
But he is apprehended by two gamekeepers who recognize him as the deposed king. They ask him, well, if thou be a king, where's thy crown?
Oh, that's a good question.
Right. And Henry gives a response that echoes through the centuries. He points to his heart and says, "My crown is in my heart, not on my head, not decked with diamonds and Indian stones, not to be seen. My crown is called content. A crown it is that seldom kings enjoy."
I mean, that is just incredible writing, and Hazlitt leans heavily into this moment. He argues that this is a true and beautiful description of a quiet disposition.
He thinks Henry means it.
He does. He says, it is not the splenetic whining of a disappointed politician.
Yeah.
Because, you see that all the time. If someone loses an election or gets passed over for a promotion, and suddenly they claim they never wanted the job anyway.
Right, sour grapes.
Exactly, sour grapes. But Hazlitt says, Henry is entirely sincere. Henry has achieved a level of inner contentment that is completely independent of external status.
It is the ultimate expression of asceticism. Henry has detached his self-worth from the trappings of power.
Hazlitt calls it beautiful. And in a vacuum, it is. Finding inner contentment regardless of your circumstances is basically Stoicism 101.
Right.
But I have to push back on Hazlitt here.
Right.
Because Henry isn't in a vacuum. He is the king of England. He doesn't have the luxury of being a shepherd.
No, he doesn't.
There is a literal bloodbath happening 50 yards away because of his inability to lead. Isn't this crown of content just dressed up cowardice?
You're saying it's an escape.
Yeah, it is spiritual bypassing. It is incredibly easy to claim you love the simple life when you're utterly failing at the complex one you were given.
That's a great point. You are identifying the central tragedy of Henry's character and the precise limit of this wisdom. The philosophy is beautiful for a monk in a monastery. It is disastrous for a monarch on a battlefield. His inner peace is purchased entirely with external chaos.
Which poses a massive question for you as you evaluate your own life today. Is the crown of content an enlightenment you should strive for? Or is it a convenient excuse you use to avoid doing the hard, messy, confrontational work your position in life actually demands of you?
Because when you abandon the messy work, you create a vacuum. And in a bear garden, nature abhors a vacuum.
Oh, totally. Which brings us to the obstacles to growth in this text. When the person in charge refuses to protect the system breeds predators. Because Henry refuses to fight, monsters step in to fill the void.
We really have to look closely at the monsters created by passive goodness.
Let's do it.
The reactions to Henry's passivity are extreme, and they begin with his own wife, Queen Margaret. We saw her initial fury when Henry disinherited their son.
When she called him a timorous wretch.
Right. But as the war drags on and the trauma compounds, she hardens into something genuinely terrifying. The Yorkists actually capture her at one point, but the tide turns, and at the Battle of Wakefield, Margaret captures the Duke of York.
And the scene that follows is arguably one of the most brutal, psychologically devastating sequences in all of Shakespeare.
It is absolutely harrowing. Margaret doesn't just execute York, she orchestrates his psychological destruction. She places him on a molehill.
Wait, a molehill again?
Yes, a dark, twisted mirror to Henry's peaceful moment.
Wow.
She orders a paper crown put on York's head to mock his ambition for the throne. And then she delivers the ultimate cruelty. York is weeping, and she offers him a napkin to wipe his tears.
Oh, no.
But the napkin has been dipped in the blood of York's young, innocent son, Rutland, who was just murdered by Margaret's ally, Lord Clifford.
She taunts a father with his murdered child's blood. The visceral horror of that action just breaks York completely.
Understand.
His response to her is legendary. He looks at her and calls her the she-wolf of France. He tells her that women are supposed to be soft, mild, pitiful, but she is stern, obdurate, flinty, remorseless.
Yeah.
And he delivers the famous line, "Oh, tiger's heart wrapped in a woman's hide."
Margaret is just completely consumed by vengeance. But she isn't the only monster born in this environment. The House of York produces its own apex predator.
Who is that?
Richard of Gloucester, the man who has eventually become the infamous Richard III.
Yes. Richard's origin story is fascinating because Shakespeare links his physical form directly to his psychological development, right?
He does. Henry later describes Richard as an indigested and deformed lump, noting the unnatural signs at his birth. Like that dog's howl, the owl shrieked, and that Richard was born with teeth.
Oh, with teeth.
That's
That's
great. And Richard takes this physical deformity and the societal rejection that comes with it, and he turns it into a psychological manifesto. In Act 3, he delivers a massive soliloquy where he laments that love has forsworn him in his mother's womb. He says nature bribed love to shrink his arm like a withered shrub, to put an envious mountain on his back where deformity sits to mock his body.
He's so self-aware of it.
Yes! And because he feels he has been robbed of the capacity to be loved, he decides to completely embrace the role of the monster.
He just leans into it. He strips away all moral pretense.
Yeah.
He says then, since this earth affords no joy to me but to command, to check, to o'erbear, such as are of better person than myself, I'll make my heaven to dream upon the crown.
Right.
He outlines his strategy in chilling detail. He says he will smile and murder while I smile. He boasts that he can set the murderous Machiavelli to school.
He thinks he's better than Machiavelli.
Yeah. And he ends the speech with a declaration of absolute terrifying independence. He just says, I am myself alone.
And you know, this is where we confront a major obstacle for modern listeners. Despite how horrifying Queen Margaret and Richard of Gloucester are, if you pay attention to your own reactions while reading or watching this play, you often find yourself drawn to them.
Really?
Yeah. Sometimes, uncomfortably, you might even find yourself rooting for them over the saintly Henry.
Wait. Rooting for the woman handing out blood-soaked napkins and the man gleefully plotting to murder his own family.
In a way, yes.
How?
Because they possess agency. Consider Margaret. From a primal evolutionary perspective, she's violently protecting her offspring. Earlier in the text, Lord Clifford berates Henry's passivity by pointing to nature.
Right.
He says even unreasonable creatures feed their young. He says the smallest worm will turn, being trodden on, and doves will peck in safeguard of their brood.
Doves will peck.
Exactly. Margaret's ferocity is terrifying, but it is deeply, recognizably primal. She is fighting for her son's birthright because the man whose job it was to do it refused to do it.
Okay, I see that. And Richard. Why on earth do we root for Richard?
Because Richard's utter self-reliance is a dark mirror to our own desires for control.
Oh, I hate that you're right about that.
Right. He refuses to be a victim of his circumstances. He is dealt a terrible, unfair hand by nature and society, and instead of weeping on a molehill about it like Henry, he seizes absolute control of his destiny. Unlike Henry, who lets the wind blow him wherever it will, Richard decides he will become the hurricane.
Man, that is the classic anti-hero dilemma. And it is a massive trap for us today. We watch these characters or we see these archetypes in our own lives and we think, well, at least Margaret is fighting for her kid.
Right. At least she's doing something.
Or at least Richard is taking charge and getting things done. We mistake raw, unbridled aggression for effective leadership simply because the alternative, Henry's passive hand-wringing, is so deeply frustrating.
We excuse ruthless ambition if it gets results.
We really do. And this transitions perfectly into our modern translation. Because how do you navigate 21st century ambition, conflict, and leadership using these 15th century dynamics?
The mindsets are exactly the same.
They are. The mindsets Shakespeare outlines here are alive and well in your workplace, your community, and your relationships right now. And we can look at this through a framework of 3 distinct leadership failures.
Okay, let's start with the failure of impulsivity. Look at King Edward, the Duke of York's eldest son, who takes the throne after York is killed.
Edward is a walking cautionary tale for modern decision-making.
It really is. Edward represents the prioritization of short-term gratification over long-term stability. As we mentioned earlier, his key ally, Warwick, is in France doing the incredibly difficult, nuanced work of geopolitical statesmanship.
Trying to lock down a treaty.
Right. Warwick is trying to secure an alliance with the French king by arranging a marriage between Edward and the king's sister-in-law, Lady Bona.
And while his top executive is out trying to save the company, what is the CEO doing?
Edward is at home and he meets Lady Grey, a widow petitioning to get her late husband's lands restored. Edward decides he just wants to sleep with her.
Unbelievable.
He propositions her directly. She refuses, stating her honesty is her only dower, and she would rather lie in prison than be his mistress.
So what does he do?
Because he cannot have her on his terms, Edward impulsively decides to marry her and make her Queen of England.
He blows up a vital international alliance, humiliates his greatest general, and sparks an entirely new round of civil war, all because he couldn't control his immediate desires.
Short-term win, long-term disaster.
It is the ultimate example of a leader who sacrifices the structural integrity of the entire organization for a quick personal win.
Absolutely. Now, contrast Edward's lack of discipline with Queen Margaret's leadership during a crisis. Towards the end of the play, before the final disastrous battle at Tewkesbury, Margaret delivers what is essentially a masterclass in resilience.
Okay.
Her forces have suffered catastrophic setbacks.
Yeah.
Warwick has flicked back to her side, but now he is dead. The cause looks entirely lost.
And she delivers this incredible shipwreck speech.
Yes. She stands before her exhausted, terrified followers and says, "Great lords, wise men ne'er sit and wail their loss, but cheerly seek how to redress their harms." She compares their political cause to a ship caught in a massive storm.
The mast is blown overboard, the cable is broken, the sails are torn.
But she insists, yet lives our pilot still. She argues it is shameful and pathetic for the pilot to leave the helm and weep, adding water to the sea with his tears while the ship splits on the rock.
She tells him to grab the wheel. She says, "We will not from the helm to sit and weep, but keep our course, though the rough winds say no." I mean, it is pure, unadulterated resilience. She refuses to give up.
She's a force of nature. But then on the most extreme end of the spectrum, we have Richard, representing the ultimate zero-sum mindset.
Right.
Richard views life entirely as a game of domination, where everyone else is an obstacle. He views his own brothers, King Edward and George, the Duke of Clarence, simply as pieces on a chessboard to be eliminated.
There's a moment where Richard compares his ambition to being lost in a forest, and the imagery is just haunting.
I love that speech.
He says he is like one lost in a thorny wood that rents the thorns and is rent with the thorns, seeking a way and straying from the way, not knowing how to find the open air, but toiling desperately to find it out, torment myself to catch the English crown.
It is the perfect mechanical metaphor for toxic individualism.
I am myself alone. I really have to ask you listening to apply this to your own life. If you view your career, your industry, or even your social circle entirely as a game to get the golden crown.
Whatever that crown is for you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Doesn't it inevitably lead to Richard's paranoia? You end up trapped in a thorny wood, tearing yourself apart, bleeding out, isolating yourself from every human connection just to find the open air.
It absolutely does. Richard believes that acquiring absolute power will set him free, but the ruthless pursuit of that power is the very thing that traps him in the thorns. He achieves his crown eventually, but he lives in a hell of his own making, utterly devoid of trust, love, or security.
So we have these incredible, vivid archetypes here. The passive king, the primal queen, the impulsive CEO, the predatory brother. And this leads directly to our comparative insight.
Hazlitt actually makes a brilliant observation about why Shakespeare's characters resonate so deeply across centuries and cultures.
What does he say?
Hazlitt notes that Shakespeare's true genius lies in his ability to draw characters that are deeply distinct, yet entirely universal. He doesn't just create cut-and-paste villains or cookie-cutter heroes. He writes, all these several personages were as different in Shakespeare as they would have been in themselves. His imagination borrowed from the life.
Shakespeare isn't giving you a moral lecture. He is giving you a laboratory. He takes different worldviews, puts them in a locked room, shakes it up, and shows you the chemical reaction.
So let's analyze that reaction. King Henry VI represents a flawed, distorted version of asceticism or stoicism.
Good.
He wants to withdraw from worldly attachments. The Stoic ideal is to maintain inner peace regardless of external chaos, which Henry achieves on his molehill.
But the critical flaw is his abdication of duty. He tries to live the life of a monk while occupying the seat of a king.
Precisely. Then you have Richard of Gloucester, who represents pure, unfiltered Machiavellianism.
Right.
He is the living embodiment of the philosophy that it is better to be feared than loved, and that the ends, the crown, justify any horrific means required to grasp it.
And Margaret represents tribalism, the primal force that will burn the entire forest down to protect its own cub. When you put the distorted Stoic, the Machiavellian, and the tribalist in the same bear garden, the inevitable result is tragedy.
It forces you to evaluate your own default settings. When your environment becomes chaotic, which of these archetypes do you default to?
Which brings us to the practical how-to. We've spent a lot of time in the blood and mud of the 15th century today.
Yes.
Let's bring this directly into your life today.
Yes.
Based on the insights from Henry, Margaret, and Richard, we have 2 specific practices for you to reflect on this week.
Practice number 1, we are calling this the Crown of Content Audit.
I like that.
I want you to take a serious inventory of your own ambition. Look at the crowns you are currently chasing. That might be a literal promotion at work, a specific financial milestone, achieving a certain social status, or honestly, even just the desperate need to be proven right in an ongoing family argument.
Ooh, that last one hits close to home. Ask yourself, are you seeking that crown at the expense of your own peace?
Right. Henry found his crown of content in his heart, even after he had lost his entire kingdom. How can you cultivate Henry's crown of content within your own mind today? But, and this is the crucial pivot, how do you cultivate that inner peace without abdicating your actual responsibilities to the people who rely on you?
That is the tightrope walk right there. You want Henry's peace, but you cannot afford his passivity. Which leads to practice number 2, the bear garden boundary.
Okay, tell us about this one.
I want you to look at the conflicts currently playing out in your life, your workplace, or your family. Are you operating like Margaret and Richard? Do you assume that every slight, every email, every disagreement requires you to pick up a bloody axe and go to war?
Right. Are you always on the attack?
Exactly. Are you viewing your colleagues as enemies in a zero-sum game of survival?
Or, conversely, are you operating like Henry? Are you letting people walk all over you? And worse, are you letting them walk all over the people you were supposed to protect, simply because you are terrified of having an uncomfortable conversation?
It's so common. Here's your core reflection question to carry with you this week. What is the middle ground between Henry's spineless goodness and Richard's spine-chilling ambition? How do you stand up and defend your brood, your team, your family, your core values, without losing your humanity in the process?
It requires profound daily practice of self-awareness. You must develop the courage to act decisively, paired with the moral compass to ensure your actions don't create more monsters in the world.
It is incredibly heavy, demanding work. But before we wrap up this exploration, Shakespeare refuses to let us off the hook with a simple summary.
He really doesn't.
He leaves us with one final, incredibly provocative thought at the very end of the text.
Yeah, in the final act, Richard of Gloucester goes to the Tower of London, where King Henry is imprisoned, with the explicit purpose of murdering him.
The wolves finally reach the trembling lamb in his cage.
Exactly.
Henry knows exactly why Richard is there. And in his final moments, Henry finally finds his voice. He prophesies all the misery and destruction Richard is going to bring to the world. Richard, impatient and ruthless, stabs him.
But it is what Henry does with his dying breath that completely upends the moral universe of the play.
Right. As he is bleeding out, Henry looks at his murderer and says, "Oh, God, forgive my sins and pardon thee."
He uses his final breath to forgive the monster who kills him.
He forgives him. And Richard's response is immediate mockery. He pulls his bloody sword out, looks down, and says, "What will the aspiring blood of Lancaster sink in the ground?" And he stabs the dead body again, just to be sure.
It is a terrifying, jarring juxtaposition of absolute grace and absolute malice.
So I leave you to mull over this final image. In a ruthless world, in a bear garden where everyone is out for themselves and survival seems to demand brutality, is Henry's final act of forgiveness the ultimate proof of his weakness? Or is it the only true, enduring act of defiance against a culture of vengeance?
That is a question that challenges the very foundation of how we define strength.
That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.